Okay, it looks like we are live. So a really warm welcome to everyone this evening, those who are joining us from far and from near. So good morning or good afternoon or good evening. This is our second installment of the 2025 Mind Matter series at Mind and Life Europe. And as many of you know, this year at MLE, we have devoted much of our programming, and especially our Mind Matter series, to what we are calling Arts and Aesthetics in the Enactive Fold, where we are trying to turn our attention to some of the deeply embedded and embodied affinities between artistic practice, and that includes all forms of creative practice and, of course, improvisation, and our philosophical and scientific work grounded in the enactive approach developed by our co-founder, Francisco Varela. So you'll see this in some of our in-person programming, but in much of our online programming this year. And in this series, those who've followed this series since the beginning know that this is really where we try to showcase some of the world's most prominent researchers and practitioners in contemplative science or contemplative practices. And so we've had past guests such as B. Alan Wallace, Mathieu Ricard, Mingyur Rinpoche, Roshi Joan Halifax, Richie Davidson, Stephen Batchelor, and many, many more, and most recently Jane Hirschfield. So we are so thrilled this evening to have Dr. Stephen Nachmanovitch with us, whom I will introduce in just a moment. And this evening is going to follow a more unusual format. So in the true spirit of improvisation, we are going to hand over the floor to Stephen at a certain point, but there will be a fair amount of interaction. It'll be a lightly guided sharing and conversation, and then we'll open it up into a larger conversation with the live Zoom audience. So I'd like to introduce Stephen. Dr. Stephen Nachmanovitch is an improvisational violinist who performs and teaches internationally at the intersections of multimedia, performance arts, ecology, and philosophy. He's the author of 2 books on the creative process, and we can highly recommend both of them, Free Play and The Art of Is, both of which have become sort of Bibles of creativity and improvisation. So if you don't know them, we'd really encourage you to look into those. Born in 1950, Stephen graduated in 1971 from Harvard with a degree in psychology, and in 1975 from the University of California, where he earned a PhD in the history of consciousness for an exploration of William Blake. His mentor was the anthropologist and philosopher Gregory Bateson. He's taught and lectured in many countries on creativity and the spiritual, social, and ethical underpinnings of art. Since the 1970s, he's been a pioneer in free improvisation on violin, viola, and electric violin. He's presented lectures, masterclasses, and workshops at many universities and conservatories, and has had numerous appearances on radio, television, music, dance, theater, and film, and has developed programs melding art, music, literature, and computer technology. He has published articles in many fields since 1966 and has created computer software, including the World Music Menu and Visual Music Tone Painter. He has been a Buddhist practitioner for decades, and his Buddhist and musical practices inform each other. He is currently performing, recording, teaching, and writing, and lives with his family in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so this evening's title, as it came to us, is Mind and Life Are Playing, Creating, Improvising, Even in Times of Terror. And so with that, we would like to gently invite you, Stephen, to take the floor, take it away, take us on the journey that you would like to take us on, and we will step in with some questions as we feel inspired, or as we feel would be invited. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with you guys today. And This violin is a little bit heavier than a normal violin. A normal violin weighs 1 pound. This violin weighs 1.3 pounds. This bow weighs about 50 grams. And I brought down from upstairs this dumbbell, which weighs 15 pounds, or for our friends in Europe, 7 kilos. So I'm 75 years old and I can lift this okay, but it's definitely work for me to lift it. And especially if I try to really move it around and wiggle it, it's a lot of work. And so if you pick up a weight like this, you're very conscious of that work. But what's interesting about this particular quantity of weight, 15 pounds, is that it is close to the air pressure at sea level, which is 14.7 pounds per square inch. So that means a square inch is about this much. So for people in Europe, it's somewhat more than a kilo per square centimeter. So that means that every time I move my hand, I am lifting 15 pounds per square inch over the whole surface of my body. And that seems like an extraordinary amount of work. Last night, I just measured my hand, and it comes to about 24 square inches, the surface of the hand. So what does that mean? It means that when I do this, I am lifting 352 pounds, or 160 some odd kilos. Now, I'm conscious of picking up the dumbbell and it being work, but of course we're unconscious of the 15 pounds per square inch that we're carrying on every surface of our body. Conscious, unconscious. Every plant out there, if you look out the window, every plant with a leaf that's moving and waving is carrying that 15 pounds per square inch. So this is really kind of miraculous. You know, in our world, people feel depressed sometimes. People who are living under dictatorships or living under regimes that are trying to be dictatorships feel oppressed. I was talking to my friend Jonathan Cott a couple days ago, and I described this business of lifting 352 pounds every time I wiggle my hand around. And Jonathan coined the word up-pressed. You're not depressed, you're not oppressed, you're up-pressed. And this is kind of a miraculous phenomenon. You know, when we are, those of us who create things in the arts, those of us who are scientists, those of us who are scholars and teaching ideas and working with ideas, and many of these ideas seem obscure or hard to understand, or you play a concert that 7 people attend, or you give a poetry reading that 3 people attend. And that can be frustrating. In Buddhism, they have the word dukkha, which refers to frustration. Clinging to how you think things ought to be is frustrating. So if you're facing a political regime, if you're facing climate catastrophes, doing your little bit of music or writing or teaching or research can seem like it's a tiny addition to the world. But here you are lifting all this weight all the time. In Chinese, there's a term in Tai Chi, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but it's called peng. And it refers to the upward and outward movement of the body and breath. And peng is what Jonathan Cott referred to as oppression. So we're all able to do this. We all do it all the time. We are very impressive beings. That's another contrast to depression and oppression. So there's a Zen koan about two monks, two practitioners, talking about Avalokiteshvara, who's the bodhisattva of great compassion. Avalokiteshvara is usually pictured with 1,000 arms, 1,000 hands, and the hands all have eyes in them. And Avalokiteshvara's name in some contexts means who hears the cries of the world. There's so much going on, there's so much suffering, there's so many difficulties. And so Avalokiteshvara has all these hands and eyes, which still aren't enough to fix all the world's problems. So one practitioner asks the other, what does Avalokiteshvara have so many hands and eyes for? And the other guy answers, it's like reaching behind your head for a pillow in the dark. And the first guy says, I think I know what you mean. And the second guy says, well, what does it mean? And the first guy says, all over the body, hands and eyes. You know, thinking of this sense of oppressing and of being capable of doing so many things when we're just one little human body. And the second guy says, well, that's pretty good, but you've only got 80% of it. And the first guy says, well, what's the other 20%? And he says, throughout the body, hands and eyes. So within every square inch, not just every square inch, but every cubic inch of the interior of a body, of the interior of the body of every plant that you look at out there, out the window, are these infinitely many hands and eyes that are capable of comprehending the world and acting within it. And that's the secret weapon we have for making art, making music, making scholarship, making science, making compassionate action in the world, even though the world looks like it's getting really, really difficult. So for those who are fans of Freud, there's yet another word for pung or oppression, and that's sublimate. Because the word sublimate actually means sublime, as means up to the limits, up to the top, the limits of the room, the limits of the sky. You take the harshness that you may be presented with and you sublimate it up to something really interesting and perhaps even something that's communicable to other people and helpful to other people and has a form. The other interesting thing about these two machines, this machine and this machine, is that they're inherently unstable. They don't rest anywhere. They're constantly moving. They're constantly out of balance. There was an incident where a famous violinist was playing at the Kennedy Center here in Washington, D.C., and there was a episode that happened right as the concert was beginning with the current Vice President of the United States walked into the audience, and everybody in the audience booed him. And the concert began, and later the violinist was interviewed and said that the booing sort of threw him off balance, which I thought was a very strange statement, because this is always off balance. This is always off balance. They never sit anywhere securely. They're analog. Ansel Adams, the great photographer, said something about the creative process, that the soup stirs the cook. You know, many people practice an art or practice a form of whatever it is, academic scholarship, craft, business, politics, in the hope that they will then gain control. The concept of control is really, really important in Western civilization. And it's the source of a lot of dukkha. It's the source of a lot of frustration. But of course, you know, you're never in control. What you are able to do is something is sliding this way, and you say, oh, I'd rather slide it this way. So what we are capable of doing is adjustment. Um, I'm sitting on a chair. I think almost everybody in this Zoom conversation in many, many countries, we're all probably sitting on chairs, right? So if you're sitting on a chair, it means you are in a state of constant auto adjustment. So your body slightly tilts this way. Of course, I'm exaggerating here to make it visible, but your body slightly tilts this way. And so you have muscles on the other side that pull it back the other way. And your body slightly tilts the other way and you tilt it back this way. You're driving a car and you're driving the car straight down the road, but you're constantly adjusting the steering wheel back and forth. So this is called cybernetics or systems theory, or it was called cybernetics until cybernetics came in popular language to mean evil robots. But what it really means is self-regulation, self-adjustment, all the kinds of things that systems theorists study. There's this very important idea of autopoiesis, self-making, self-regulating, self-creating. And it relates to this whole idea of how you're sitting up, you think I'm sitting still, I could be a meditator sitting still on a cushion and I look like I'm sitting like a rock and not moving, but actually I'm constantly engaging in minor vibrations and adjustments and movements that are correcting and moving and shifting and sliding and wiggling. And but there's also the contrary idea. A scientist named Beth Dempster invented the word sympoiesis as the contrary to autopoiesis. That in sympoiesis, of course, I'm not just a system within my skin that's self-adjusting and self-correcting and self-generating. I'm constantly in an environment and I'm constantly interacting with my environment and the information is constantly flowing back and forth and through. And the things that makes us biological organisms is that the skin and the membranes of each of our cells and everything else that structures a biological organism is a semi-permeable membrane. Some things get stopped, some things come out, some things go through, some things get passed and changed and morphed. And if we're practicing an art form, we are more or less consciously playing with this, with being constantly influenced, constantly changing, constantly self-correcting, constantly being corrected. I may be a solo musician sitting here playing my instrument in my idiosyncratic way, but all the teachers that I've had are sitting here with me. They're all there influencing what I do. If I rode in my car this morning and heard a music as part of a commercial and I didn't like that music, then my dislike of that music is present with me now. And I'm trying to do something that's different than it. If every book that I've read, every conversation that I've ever had, every lesson that I've taken, every observation that I've made of other people playing an instrument like this or different than this is entered into my supposedly solo playing. So no solo is solo. We're constantly in a sympoetic relationship with our environment and with our fellows, with my friend John Seeley, psychoanalyst and sociologist, um, said that we live in a cloud of companions, the living, the dead, our friends, everyone around us is constantly helping us lift that 15 pounds per square inch, is constantly helping us figure out what to do with this strange and mysterious instrument, helping us figure out what we're going to do with the instruments that may be left to us after some catastrophe or accident or difficult circumstances that might arise in our lives. So Amy and Johanna.
Yeah, this brings to mind a lot. Amy, did you want to jump in with something specific? I had about 6 different threads that could be woven in at this point.
Well, how about to start something about you've brought us into creativity and you've brought us into science, which maybe could bring us back to a little more autobiography, a little bit, for example, um, Bateson into your life between art and science, or rubbing between art and science.
Rubbing between art and science. I love that. I love that. Um, yeah, Gregory Bateson was, I was very, very, very fortunate in my life to have had many amazing teachers and elder friends. Um, but Gregory Bateson was the one who really most affected me in my life and who's I'm still sort of walking down the path that I was walking with his help. Um, Gregory, for those of you who don't know, he was I coined the word holomath to describe him because he's a person, he wasn't a polymath as somebody who's a surgeon but also a visual artist or something like that, who is great in two fields. But Gregory really was um, he was working the pattern that connects many sciences and many kinds of practice. He's usually labeled as an anthropologist or philosopher or biologist or systems theorist or cybernetician, or you can go on a long list. But what he was really interested in was the pattern that connects all those activities and all of those ways of knowing. Um, but Gregory always described himself as a scientist. And when I met him, I basically knew him through the decades of my 20s and his 70s. Um, I thought I was going to be a scientist. I started when I was a kid. I thought I was going to be a biologist. And first thing I published was in the Journal of Protozoology, making movies of protozoa wiggling around under the microscope. And interesting enough, both Gregory Bateson and Jean Piaget started that way. And um, I was going to be a social scientist when I knew Gregory. I was very interested in the study of play in animals, in children. I was going to be perhaps a cognitive psychologist or something like that. And I'd had a previous mentor, Jerome Bruner, who was really quite wonderful, who um, helped me organize what I was studying about play. But play was a study, of course, even though we're all doing it, it became something to study and something to be quite fascinated by. But Gregory And Gregory had contributed a lot about the study of play. But one of the first things he did when I started working with him, playing with him, was open up William Blake to me. And William Blake talks about the creative process in such a way that you can't study it, you have to do it. And I ended up writing my dissertation with Gregory on William Blake and his illustrations of the book of Job. And it really changed me fundamentally because I sort of shifted from the side of perceiving, which is how science is usually understood, to the side of acting, which is how art is usually understood. And I discovered that I couldn't just understand something, I had to start doing it. And after Gregory died, at that time already, during the years that I was with him, I discovered improvisation. I had been trained as a classical violinist, but I discovered one day that I didn't need composers anymore, much as I love them. And I was capable of moving with my body and making sounds that will never happen again and have never happened before. After Gregory died, he died in the guest house of the San Francisco Zen Center. And the Zen folks at San Francisco Zen Center were absolutely remarkable human beings, assisting very quietly with what needed to be done in the very difficult condition of a dying person. And that was my introduction to the dying process. Many years later, I met my wife, Leslie Blackhall, who is a hospice and palliative care physician. And she has a lot to say about that process. But one day Gregory was gone, and there I was in the midst of these black-robed Zen students. And I realized that was the next thing I needed to understand, was the idea of practice. You know, I'd read in many books and talks about Buddhism that sitting still on a cushion is practice. And so I knew that word, practice, but it wasn't until later that I realized, well, there's this thing too, and this is called practice, and I'd been doing this all my life. And I didn't make the connection until then that this is the same thing, that moving in a dynamic, unbalanced, constantly changing pattern of unstoppable motion was the same thing really as sitting still on a cushion where you are balancing and being a body. And so this whole active business, there's the Japanese word do, which means away. It's the same as the Chinese Dao. And to do any activity, dance, music, car mechanics, fixing a computer, as a do, as a practice, as a way, you know, they have the word way with a capital W, is very, very interesting, and it changes your relationship to life. Perception is active. I mean, I learned this long ago when I was studying psychology, that it's not like something comes into your eye and the brain processes it and you go, oh, that's a chair, that you are constantly interacting and enacting a relationship with your percepts. There's the famous story of what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain. Nerve cells at the very primitive level are constantly enacting the creation and the recreation of the chair that you're looking at. So Gregory really popped me out of the world of being a scientist or scholar or whatever I was into the world of being an artist. I had later a very, very dear friend and elder colleague, Rachel Rosenthal, who was a theater person and one of the founders of performance art. And we did a lot of shows together in the 1980s. And Rachel called her workshops and her method of practice DBD, do by doing. And that was the thing, that was the barrier that I jumped over thanks to Gregory, is to jump into doing by doing.
But you also speak, Stephen, of improvising as a kind of research. Can you say that as a tool for investigating reality?
Yes. Yes. Improvising is a tool for investigating reality because, after all, you can only know by performing experiments. This was the big leap that was taken in the Renaissance by, all the forerunners of modern science, that you don't believe what reality is because the church tells you this or because some book tells you. You have to believe what you experiment with and try yourself, and that other people have tried. And if other people have tried something, you have to be able to replicate it and get usually probably a somewhat different result. but, but you'll get a result. And so, I'm investigating this again in just the practical matter of playing the violin. You play a tone. That is supposedly a C. Actually, that's two C's. Let's take the other one away. And if you're a kid, when I was a kid, I'd play a C, and my teacher would say, "No, that's too sharp." And what he meant by too sharp, like that, I just felt, even though he was a wonderful person in many ways, there's this traditional method of teaching music by correcting mistakes. And so you are sort of perpetually wrong. I tell a story about there was a man in the 18th century called Johann van Beethoven, who was a musician, and he had a little boy named Ludwig van Beethoven, who was a very talented young pianist. And Johann had this image in his mind of Mozart, who went slightly before Beethoven, and Mozart was this fantastic child prodigy, and his father took him all around the crowned heads of Europe, and he amazed everyone, and gifts flowed his way, and he was a big deal. So little Ludwig van Beethoven was going to be the next Mozart, his father thought. And so Johann would sit over his son at the piano and whack him with a stick on the fingers every time he made a mistake. Okay. I was teaching a workshop years ago at Juilliard in New York, where all of the students are way better musicians than I will ever be. And they improvised, this group of students who had never improvised before, improvised this gorgeous piece. And then they improvised another gorgeous piece. And then in the third one, it was a little bit off and they weren't quite listening to each other as intently. And I could see in everybody's faces that there was this guilt because these students were used to the idea of excellence. And you live in that world for excellence and being certifiably excellent. And so I told them the story of Johann van Beethoven with the stick. And of course, many people who were not geniuses like Beethoven also got taught the same way. And harsh methods of education are in use still today in many ways. Um, so I had the students just put their instruments down and just walk around the room kissing your fingers. And they just milled around the room. There were about 15 of them kissing their fingers and healing those wounds from the stick. And then they played another piece, again, of course, completely improvised. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Nobody was giving orders or directions or agreements. And it was magnificent. And an observer sitting in that room would not have known that this wasn't a completely composed piece of contemporary music that had been practiced for months. And so this whole business of listening, paying attention to each other, not being guilty, playing the nice thing about this type of instrument, a piano, here's an instrument here which has keys, and there's a C and there's a B, and they're next to each other, but you can't play in the crack between them. But this instrument and the double bass and the cello and the slide trombone and your vocal cords have infinitely many cracks. So you can be sliding around in there and finding all kinds of intermediate tones that don't have names and make use of them. And of course, not everybody here is a person who plays on one of these. But you all have activities in your life that work that way. And you can apply some of your 15 pounds per square inch of oppression to developing your creativity and your ability to play between the cracks and to adjust the tones. If you make a tone you don't like, you can just shift it. You can just change it. It's okay to be constantly making tones you don't like and constantly changing and shifting a little bit and adjusting a little bit and bringing it to a place that's really interesting to you.
Stephen, would you be willing to talk at this moment about the importance of temenos in what you're describing? So in order
Ah,
enough, one could say, safety to take these risks and to play
yes,
and to listen,
yes,
open oneself to that precariousness. Maybe you can talk
yes.
a little bit about the importance of temenos in your work.
Yeah, that's a great question, Johanna. Um, Temenos, I actually learned about Temenos from another wonderful elder friend named Kathleen Rain, who was a poet. She was an English poet, a Blake scholar, a Jung scholar, who lived in France for much of her life. But when I met her, she was in London. And she actually had a little organization called Temenos. Temenos is a ancient Greek word which refers to the sacred precinct of a temple, the place within which you have the right and the ability to do sacred things.
What?
I'm actually sitting in one right now. Um, when I was younger, when I started writing free play, that was in the early 1980s. Uh, I I lived in an artist colony for 3 sessions of most of 1983, called Dorland Mountain Colony in the Southern California mountains. So it was 300 acres of mostly wilderness in the Palomar Mountains, no electricity, no phone, Clivus Multrum recycling toilets, kerosene lamps, well water, and so forth. But there would be in your cabin like a turn of the century Steinway piano that Mrs. Dorland had bought from Rachmaninoff. And, and you'd be able to sequester yourself and do your writing or do your music or do your painting or whatever it might be. There's a lot of artist colonies like that in the world today, which are wonderful places. And so, except for this nice piano, I'm not really a pianist, but it was great to live with this instrument. Um, and I was writing the book that became Free Play. But I also still had, even though I was on retreat, I still had bills to pay and I still had letters to answer and all that stuff from the secular world. And I'd be sitting there at my little desk and I'm writing some prose, but okay, here's the bill and here's the letter I have to answer. And the bills and the letters would start throbbing in front of my eyes and it would become very irritating. And I realized it's not irritating, it just belongs to a different universe. So I drove down to the nearest town, which was about 10 miles away, and I bought a card table and a little folding chair. And I put them in the opposite corner. It was a very small room, and I put them in the opposite corner of the small room. And now I had a sacred desk and a secular desk.
Mhm.
And it was fantastic, and I've kept that up ever since. So now I'm fortunate enough to have a house, and I'm here in my studio, which is the sacred desk, and right next door is the secular office, where I pay bills and answer letters and do all of that stuff that you have to do to maintain life. And, everybody, T.S. Eliot worked for a bank in order to support his life as a poet, and Charles Ives worked for an insurance company in order to support his life as a composer, and so on and so on and so on. William Carlos Williams was a doctor. And so we all have these balances that we make. But if you can carve out, it doesn't have to be a whole studio, it can just be like a corner of your kitchen table that you carve out as the temenos. This is the sacred precinct within which I can do my work, and the so-called outside world doesn't have to enter for a period of time. And also there's the sacred time, there's the practice of the Sabbath, which I regard, there's a lot of things in the Bible that are really kind of horrible about smiting and domination of other life forms, and the list goes on. But really the most innovative invention of Western civilization in the last 4,000 years was the Sabbath. The idea that, okay, here's one day of the week that you take off, you're not working, or you're not working for somebody else, and you're within the space that you can define as a sacred space. And I have tried to keep up this practice, even though it doesn't have a religious dimension for me, or it has a religious dimension in another sphere. I try to take one day a week. Usually these days it's Thursday, but that can wiggle around depending on what's happening. I unplug the internet. It's okay to use a computer for writing and doing music and so forth, but you're unplugged from the world. There's no phone. There's no demands other than a real emergency. And that's the temenos. That day is your temenos. And once again, if you're condition is such that you can't take that one day. You can take 5 minutes. You can take the length of a breath and make a temenos and weave a temenos around you. There's this wonderful passage where William Blake says that each period of the pulsation of an artery, the length of time between two pulses, is equal in its period and value to 6,000 years. And in this period, the poet's work is done. And all the great labors of all the ages are done within that period of time, the pulsation of an artery. And so you can make that temenos, even out of the briefest moment of time. I write about another extraordinary elder friend that I had was Herbert Zipper, who was a composer, conductor, born in Vienna in 1904. He was dandled on the knees of Sigmund Freud as a baby. He might have grown up to be one of the great mid-century Viennese composer, conductor luminaries. But the Anschluss came, and he was carted off with all the other Jews to Dachau. It was before the war. It was a year before the war started. And Herbert described to me what it was like on the first day of being a slave laborer, because Dachau was a slave labor camp. I was in Dachau. My son Gregory, actually, when I went with him to Munich, I had a gig there, and he came along as filmmaker 10 years ago. And he was walking down the stairs then, and he said, "Hey, Dad, we're going to Munich. Why aren't we going to Dachau?" And I go, "Oh my God, of course." And as an American Jew who'd grown up with a lot of awareness of the Holocaust, I thought nothing would be news to me. But something was news. There was a plaque in the building that had been where the officers hung out in Dachau, of a speech by Himmler, who came to tell them, to the guards, to the officers and guards at Dachau, that we're in the midst of this huge war that is destroying the cities and roads and railways of Europe. And after the war is over, we are going to need immense amounts of slave labor to rebuild the cities and rebuild the roads. And that's what you are doing here in this prison camp. You're creating a population of slave labor, copied in many ways from what Americans did in the early 19th century. And so here was this very refined artist, Herbert Zipper, conductor, composer, in this place, in this terrible place. And he, the first night he was there, he just stood there and recited some poetry. And most of the men who were his fellow prisoners were not educated. They were not sophisticated people, but something made them, we talked about pung before, and Jonathan's word, up-pressing. You know, they were up-pressed by the sound of poetry. And he ended up starting a clandestine orchestra in the concentration camp. And that clandestine orchestra did not win the war. That clandestine orchestra did not save anyone from dying. All the horrors unfolded as they were. But for those who were there, and for those who did survive, it gave them some space of breathing. It became, and he referred to, and I know Viktor Frankl, who was also in Dachau, the great psychiatrist, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. They had this experience of seeing a flash of light on a piece of barbed wire, sunlight reflected. And here you are in the worst place in the world, and you see this instant flash of light, and it's a reminder that the sun exists. And it's a reminder, it's a way of weaving a little tiny temenos in the space where you are that can create some relief and some space within which you can have a creative thought. I see Annie Bloch has a raised hand. You're
Okay,
muted.
you
Hi.
hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm 80 years old, single child, and just found a 75-year-old brother
Oh, wonderful.
because we have three parents together. One is Gregory Bateson, was kind of my bedside book for years. Okay. The other one, of course, Nachmanovitch, your son of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov,
Yes.
which is my rabbi, okay?
Ah,
My Jewish connection. And I have two quotes for everybody. He says that life is a narrow bridge. Do not fear. That's one. Narrow bridge, you can see what's beneath, of course. That doesn't need to be said, okay? And
wonderful.
The other one is, it's a mitzvah, it is a duty to be joyful. I mean, these two things are well beyond Judaism,
Yes. Yes.
So that's my second connection. And the third one, my goodness, well, the Buddhist connection, of course, and I have a memory of improvisation. I attended a clown workshop given by Zen master Bernie Glassman, and it was
yes.
with his student. The Zen student was a clown master, and they were each other teachers and students. And we, the lucky ones, we attended a weekend with them, So I have this triple connection, but also if I mention that, it's of course because there's some content in what I'm saying. And clown workshop is easier, more accessible than playing music, And you are doing improvisation in single, also in group of three, improvising a group of three in front of everybody else. I mean, letting go, you have no choice, no choice at all. So
Yes.
I really recommend that, I enjoy, your neo-klezmer, you're a fiddler on the roof. Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
So we'll get in touch. Okay.
Thank you. It's great to meet you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Shoshana.
Okay. Hi.
Hello, and nice to see you again.
Yeah, I know. After so many, I met Stephen in the 80s before you started writing your book, I think.
Yeah.
But we both went to Dorland. I only went for a few days, and it was marvelous. But what I wanted to say for this event today is really that everything that you said about music can be said about painting, because I've been doing improvisational painting for years, and I was trained in the classical way, of perspective, figure drawing, blah, blah, blah. And then in the 90s, I went to a workshop, an improvisational workshop. And it was held by, I think it was started by Michel Cassou, who's influenced a lot of people. but it was really life-changing. And all of the limitations about being perfect, about making, well, I want my painting to look as good as Matisse, all that kind of judgment and censorship of the unconscious over several years. It took several years for it to really change. But I found that when I painted in that way, improvisationally, I had the same kinds of insights and connections that I had when I was doing Buddhist meditation.
Mm.
You just are painting along, and then suddenly something occurs, some connection between something you'd never put together before. And I think it has something to do with just the mind relaxing, and you're moving into a different part of your mind than the prefrontal cortex. So, at any rate, I think what your book, both of your books have been really inspirational for me. And I'm just thank you for sharing your personal stories. I knew
Oh, thank you.
Rachel Rosenthal and her deviant.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, that was quite a time.
Yeah,
Okay,
she was amazing. Yes, yes.
okay, very good. All right. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Who's next? Monica.
Hello, hello,
Hello,
hello.
hello.
You again.
Great to see you.
Right, wonderful talk, and I'm always inspired by your not only stories, but how you express the whole knowledge about improvisation. As
Mm.
myself being improviser, the theater improviser, but also having those wonderful experience with painting watercolor, which is so improvised way of painting, where the water decides for you where it goes with the paint and with the color. So just wanted to say hi because I made to it made to I made it I could join you for a while. So thank you for all sharing all these wonderful stories of your life and inspiring um, metaphors and knowledge, which is so deep. And I agree with the person before me about meditation and yeah, life is improvisation and art is improvisation, like your book says in the title. And just wanted to say thank you and say hi because we've met before.
We have.
I also had a chance to interview, so that's online. If you look for it, you can find The Art of Yes, our talk with Stephen, and I had a chance to meet you in person too. So I feel lucky and honored, and yeah, and I wish we had another conversation soon. So thank you
I
so
hope
much.
we do. I hope we do. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Mm.
Bye. Thank you.
Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your wonderful insights into the world and music and these wonderful concepts that you're talking about. But I wanted to ask you a somewhat music-related question. And I noticed the bass. I'm a bass player, so I noticed the bass in the back of the room. And I wanted to ask you something that struck me as quite recently in the thought that an instrument is not a passive thing of wood and steel,
Mm. Mm.
but something that transforms. And in the sense that music, a successful musical performance might enact something deep in our past, something about the cave, about storytelling, about, like you talk about Temenos, a sacred space in which the communality is ignited. We know this and we've seen this and there's literature on this, but I wanted to ask you a somewhat more personal question, if I may. which is how would you characterize something very difficult to pin down, which is your own relationship with the instrument? How do you understand the instrument? And I don't want to lead the question. I want to hear what you have to say, not my opinion of it. But how do you understand the instrument as transforming yourself?
Mm, mm. That's an incredibly fine question.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I mean, I referred a little earlier to Ansel Adams talking about how the soup stirs the cook, right? And the instrument makes um, my body has a particular structure which is a little bit different from every other human body. And um, instruments have, you know, if you're a violin geek, then you know, or violin or viola or cello or
Yes.
French horn or synthesizer or geek of any particular instrument, you'll note that each instrument is unique. And this is one of the great things about crafted material, um, as opposed to manufactured material. But even manufactured material, after it's been around for a while, becomes unique. You know, your car, which is one of 250,000 um, issues of a particular model of car, may have been more or less identical to the other 249,999 of the same model when it was brand new. But even a manufactured object like a car is going to change over time and be to some extent altered by your habits of driving, altered by the variable, um, the properties of the metal. Gregory Bateson liked to talk about um, the act of tossing a pebble at a window, and you can predict, even though the window is a manufactured object and one window is like another of a particular series, you can predict that um, when the pebble hits the window will crack, and it will usually form like a star-shaped arrangement of cracks. But you can't predict where the cracks will be in that particular window. That is unique to that window and unique to that moment in space and time. And when you have an instrument that's crafted, this particular instrument was crafted by a guy named David Bruce Johnson in Birmingham, England. And, you know, it's got electronic components and mechanical components and wood components. And the way those components the way they interact with my body, the way they interact with the way that I've used the instrument in the past, the way they interact with the room, you know, because just a regular acoustic violin, viola, bass in the room becomes part of the story, you know. You begin investigating um, the the nature of the sound of an instrument, and pretty soon you get into what Buddhists call the emptiness of inherent existence, which means that um, you know, this does not exist all by itself. This exists in the form of millions of stories of activity and interconnection and craftsmanship, and the forests where the wood came from, and the rain that rained on the forest where the wood came from. And all of it, you know, as Thich Nhat Hanh referred to it, he said, instead of emptiness, we should say interbeing, because all of us components of the universe and we bounce in a certain way. talking about the 14.7 pounds per square inch of air pressure. But of course, it's really different. That pressure is constantly changing with local winds and local conditions. So every event is unique. Heraclitus, whoever he or she was famous for saying that you never step into the same river twice because everything is constantly changing. Or David Chadwick, the Zen monk and cartoonist and punk rock musician who became the biographer for Shunryu Suzuki, the great founder of San Francisco Zen Center. He once asked Suzuki Roshi this very glib, he knew it was a sort of a glib and cocky question. Well, can you explain the essence of Buddhism in one sentence? And he was expecting Suzuki to like slap him on the face or something. And, and it's kind of like the question of Hillel, the old rabbi from 2,000 years ago, who was asked to explain all of religion while he could stand on one foot. Anyway, so Suzuki Roshi immediately answered, everything changes. So everything changes, but those changes have a particular texture, like Gregory's Bateson's example of the stone hitting the glass. That pattern of change is particular to that moment and that place and that context and will never be replicated anywhere in the universe at any time.
Well, thank you. Well,
thank you. Thank you. Joshua.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Stephen. Thanks. This is it's really nice to hear you speak in person. You mentioned earlier this idea that, when you're improvising now in the evening, you're still hearing the music, or you're affected by the music you heard in the supermarket, or you're affected from the training you've had. So you're never just improvising now, but it's kind of stretched over time.
Yeah.
And, you've written too, I think, that it's never really a solo improvisation because you're playing with the music and the music's talking back to you. And Gary Hagberg, he's talked about, he has this nice analysis of John Coltrane playing a solo where he's kind of playing with a music which is not there. Like it's kind of implied in his music, but it's the drummer's playing around it, but he's not actually hitting these notes, but we can still perceive these invisible notes, and this invisible is structuring the visible. So it's kind of a technical question, I guess. I'm interested to hear, like when you're doing a solo improvisation, are you hearing the invisible, or is this invisible affecting you? Are you hearing music which we are not hearing as well, or is it purely just that sound in the room?
That is a great koan. So let's just write that down and keep it as a koan. It's so interesting. Are you playing an invisible music? It reminds me, there's that Zen statement, show me the face you had before you were born. What is the face that this music had? What's the sound that the music had outside of its existence? Or is it all in its existence in the moment that in which, here I'm rubbing my hands together. If I rub them right next to the microphone, maybe you can hear it, maybe not, but I'm making some subtle sound here. And, it brings up some of the ideas that John Cage handed to us about, is there a difference between music and noise? Is there a difference between what you're playing in your very beautifully rehearsed concert and the environmental noise of the wind and the sirens going by in the traffic outdoors and so forth? And so, of course, what's wonderful is not to have an answer for that question, but to spend the rest of your life living in the interior place that is rubbed by the two halves of your question.
Cool. Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily that abstract either, even though I put it that way. Like if you think of a groove, for example, so the reason like a groove is groovy is because you're you're not hitting the beat, you're a bit early, you're a little bit late, but that beat
Right.
is kind of there.
Right.
And that's,
Right.
I guess that's the essence of my question as well. When you're
Right.
playing, is there something
Yeah.
there that's moving you that we're not hearing?
Oh, that's very safe. Because when you say the beat is there, of course, what you're referring to is clock time,
Mm,
which is something that we have in the West. I remember a friend of mine who was a Sufi from Syria, who was a professor in the United States, met another friend of mine who was from India, and I said something about time, and he looked at her and he said, "Boy, these Westerners really have a thing about time, don't they?" And the measure of time, do you measure time by the time it takes an incense stick to burn down? What do you measure time by? In jazz, people play with a quality that is so interesting and amazing called swing, which is sort of described as ahead the beat or behind the beat or just off the beat, but never with the beat, but the beat is there, but and is the beat sort of like the Platonic um, idea of time that exists outside of our everyday bodily experience? Or is the beat determined by my heartbeat, which is, of course, slightly irregular and isn't clock time? And of course, physicists have been enamored of going down this byway for the last 100 years because obviously space and time are not what they seem to be.
yeah. Thanks. Yeah, no, really interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you.
I wonder, Stephen, if this would be the moment to have you circle back to this question of ethics, which was really
Mm,
thinking through the entire description for your intervention this evening, and thinking about also what we're thinking about at Mind and Life Europe, which is relating to the worlds at hand.
yes.
And being very much sort of metaphor, but more than a metaphor, and how improvisation, maybe as a practice, as an attitude, as an epistemology, implies also a certain ethics of moving through the world, with the world, in relation to the world. Maybe you can riff on that to bring us out.
Yes, yes, thank you, Johanna, for bringing that up. It's very, very important. Um, Blake again, he has a character named Los, who's sort of the archetype of the creative artist in Blake's mythology, who's sort of a blacksmith and a worker in metals, as Blake was as an engraver and working with molten printing plates and that sort of thing, and engraving. And he describes a scene in which Los is laboring at his forges. He's laboring at his anvils with this molten stuff, so that uh, Blake's words were, whenever any of the specters began to devour the dead, a man might feel it as though someone gnawed at his own tender nerves. So, to Blake, the creative artist is responding to um, what is happening in our world, which is not always very pretty. I mean, some of it is immensely pretty, and some of it is immensely horrible and ugly. And all of us are aware of both. Um, I talked about, at the beginning of the hour, I talked about Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of great compassion, who was, hearing the cries of the world, who had these thousands of hands and eyes, because there are so many directions to see so much suffering, and there's so much suffering to relieve. There's a story about Avalokiteshvara is standing in line for the drinking fountain, like at a school or something. And he's lined up, he's waiting for a few people, and the people are all the suffering people of the world. And there's so many of them, and he becomes so aware of how hard life is for so many of the people that are in front of him. And he thinks this is just impossible. And then he turns around and looks at the line behind him, and he sees that the line is infinite. And that's the moment where he became Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of great compassion. You can do as much as you can do. You have to be aware of what is happening in the world. You can't pretend that it's not happening. If you're fortunate to live in a nice place where that suffering is not happening at the moment, you know that at any moment, the ICE agents could break into your house, supposedly by mistake, but once they do it, it's not a mistake. To be in a world that contains death and suffering, it's very important to know. To be in a world where what you say has an effect on people is very important to know. I've been in many discussions or talks where somebody has talked about how great creativity is, how great improvisation is. It's wonderful to be able to make stuff. There's this word which has become sort of a horrible word in our world: innovation. We're asked to recognize, how great innovation is, and if you label something as innovation, that means, wow, this is fantastic. It's something new. I invented something. Well, what did you invent it for? What's the effect of your invention? What's the effect of your creation? How can it be used? How can it be misused? And virtually anything can be misused. Any great creator, there's the work of Beethoven, who was such a liberatory soul. He was a Democrat. He was a voice for the liberation of people from autocrats, from emperors. He tore he'd written the Eroica Symphony in 1803, and it was going to be dedicated to Napoleon, who was the great revolutionary who brought freedom to people in Europe. But oops, overnight Napoleon declared himself emperor. And Beethoven said, the hell with this, and he tore the front page of the manuscript in half, and he retitled the piece to the memory of a dead hero. But and Beethoven's music was so much intended to be the joy of human liberation. And there's that wonderful concert of Leonard Bernstein conducting the Ninth Symphony on the ruins of the Berlin Wall when it came down. But there was also the Nazi regime and the Stalinist regime, both using Beethoven's music as background for oppression. There was, punk rock is a genre of music that's often about liberation. But the H.W. Bush government, when they were trying to overthrow the government in Panama, used punk rock being blasted out of loudspeakers in front of the Congress building there to drive people crazy with music. And music has often been used by torturers to drive people crazy. So you can't say that music is good. You can't say that creativity is good. You can't say that art is good. It's how is it used? How is intended? How are you using it right now? How are you receiving it? Every act of creativity, every act of art or science has an ethical dimension. And it behooves us to know about that ethical dimension and to probe it and to explore it and to steer what we do and how our work is used to something that's altruistic.
Well, thank you. I don't think we could find a better place to end than where you've taken us, where you've steered us, and through the Temenos and beyond. So I think we're at about time. So if there are no other words, Amy, did you want to say anything else before we close? To jump in.
No substance. Just thank you so much, Stephen. The substance of gratitude for your coming to visit us here at Mind and Life Hero.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. What a wonderful group of people. It's just been beautiful to hang out with all of you today.
Well, thank you. All our thanks go to you, Stephen, and thanks to everyone who came and to the team who helped. And as we close out, I think we just have a couple of announcements for our next upcoming programs. So we have a few more in the month of May before we take a break in the summer. When we have our Summer Research Institute, we have a few more online events, one of which may interest a lot of folks here this evening. We'll be doing a special book launch and roundtable discussion to celebrate the new edition of Francisco Varela's 1979 classic, Principles of Biological Autonomy. So if anyone would like to sign up for that, you can check out our website or the newsletter. We will also have a wonderful friend of mine in life here, Brother Phap Lin, who's from Plum Village. So we heard about Thich Nhat Hanh and Intervene a little bit from Stephen this evening. He'll be offering, Brother Phap Lin will be offering a talk on the 22nd, mingling very much science and meditation and other creative aspects of his life as a monastic. And we have a contemplative session on the end of the month, and we'll also have our final podcast episode for this current season coming out in mid-May on the 15th. So look for that on all the major platforms. And in fact, the podcast will very much be about improvising. So feel free to follow that. And so once again, thank you so much, Stephen, and to everyone who joined us. And we hope we can continue the improvised encounter in some way in the future again.
Hope to see you, Stephen, in our midst. And thanks, Johanna, so much, and Kat and Derek.
Thanks, Amy. Have a good evening and good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye for now.
Bye for